Hi, my name is Morten, and in this video we will be taking a look at pipelines in e-commerce. We will take a look at the two common pipelines that we have referred to during the masterclass, which is the basket pipeline and the checkout pipeline. And we will also be looking at how you can create your own pipelines and how you can modify the pipelines that we have out of the box. With that in place, let's start to describe for you what a pipeline is. So a pipeline in e-commerce, you can see that as an equivalent to events in .NET. That's the best way to describe what a pipeline is, because a pipeline is basically something that are being executed at a certain point in time during your web shop's lifetime. So that could, for example, be when you add a product to your cart, when a customer checks out. Those are all events where you expect some custom business logic, or you would expect that you can do something when that event occurs. Unlike events in .NET, you have the ability to control at what order the pipeline is executed in. So, for example, the way that you hook into to an event is by subscribing to it. In a pipeline, you create some code and then you configure the pipeline to also execute that. So that's how you subscribe to a pipeline. So we will take a look at how you can subscribe to it by configuring it in the IRC container. And we will take a look at how you can modify the behavior of what's there already. And we will also take a look at how you can get an overview about what it is. So these events or pipelines are being executed at those point in times. Either you have to explicitly execute them like we've told you in the training videos. So every time you modify the basket, you execute the basket pipeline as well. So that's a rule of thumb in the platform. So that's when a pipeline is actually being executed. It's not something magic that happens. There's someone actually executing a pipeline for you. e-commerce does that for various places in the platform out of the box. You do it when you modify the basket, and e-commerce will do it, for example, when an order has been placed and the basket is being checked out. At that stage, we have a checkout pipeline that runs. So a pipeline, whenever it's executed based on some event that happens, you have that event type as the context as well as the object the pipeline is being executed for. Just like events, you have the context, what is the event arcs that you execute. Pipelines has that as well, where you pass in the object that are being modified via that pipeline. So for example, if you execute the basket pipeline, the purchase order for that basket will be passed through the pipeline, and then you can modify the order as you wish. So that's why we compare them to events in .NET, where usually we also say it's event on steroids, because you have a lot more capabilities and it's much nicer to work with than actual .NET. So that's the comparison. So now let's try to actually dive into to what's going on with the basket pipeline. The pipeline is being executed somewhere in the system. For example, here when we add to basket, e-commerce will implicitly also execute the basket pipeline. But if we take a look at the billing controller or the basket controller, for example, is a good example of where you explicitly call the pipeline. So this is where the event is fired, if we should keep that lingo and compare it to events. So here the event is being fired, and then internally here e-commerce will figure out what is the basket pipeline and what task has been injected into the pipeline. So that's where the pipeline is being executed, so someone actually initiates that. So let's take a look at the configuration for the pipeline. So here I am on docs.ecommerce.net. Under pipelines, you can actually read about all the common pipelines that we see people hook into. It's important to understand that a pipeline is a generic concept we have in the platform, so it's not strictly tied to purchase orders or baskets, but that's the two most common pipelines that you will run into when you're building a web shop. Almost every web shop needs an extension to the basket or the checkout pipeline. So it's a very common extension point. So that's why we also take an example of those in the training videos here. You can see the basket pipeline here. Here we actually have a description for each task that is being executed in the pipeline. So you can see calculate shipping discount task. You can see what type is it, which is the actual .NET implementation of the interface, as well as see the XML comment for that particular task. So you can see here, calculate shipping discount task, calculate shipping discount based on attached discount on shipment. So you will be able to see what is the task name, which in itself should be very descriptive, and then a further elaboration on what it actually does. And you can see that for all the tasks in Basket Pipeline, and you can see there's a lot. Down here in the actual configuration, that's where all the magic happens with the IOC container, because the pipelines and tasks are all put into the IOC container, just like every other component. We talked about that in the previous video about IOC and components. Pipelines here are no different. They are also put in the IOC container and composed together via configuration. So the pipeline in itself here, Basket Pipeline, which is the actual implementation, does not have all of these tasks here out of the box. We configure it to have it. So you control what's configured and what order and how, and you can also remove stuff and add stuff, and let's take a look at that a little later. But here you can see an overview about what it actually does. So it's a higher abstraction level rather than looking at code. And what we can see is that, for example, here, the first task, they are run in sequential order. So first this one, then this one, then this one, then this one, and so on and so forth, all the way down through. And you can actually see on each of the tasks what it does with a description for it. So while having configuration in XML for dependency injection is still a little old school, it still has a lot of strengths built into it, because it's much easier to control what's happening, and it's much easier to get an overview about what happens instead of simply somewhere registering some stuff and you cannot really see that. Here you have visibility, and it's very, very clear what's going on, at least on a higher abstraction level. You can see what is the individual steps that happens. And then you can modify it if you want to. So one good example could, for example, be I don't want to have anything with tax in my pipelines because tax is not relevant for my web shop. Then just remove everything that has to do with tax. Remove tax total, remove tax rate, task, everything that's related to that. So that's how a good example of how you can compose a pipeline to have the business logic that you need for your web shop. That's always how the platform is extended. It's either via changing the configuration or via creating some code that you then configure into the platform. So here it makes a lot of sense what's going on. So let's take a look at one of the examples of what's going on in the Basket Pipeline. So I will go to the source code of uCommerce, and I will find my set culture code task, which was the first task in the pipeline. We could see that right here. This is an ID for the actual component. We'll take a look at that a little later, because this does not really show what type it is, but let's take a look at that a little later. We also saw that in the previous video, so it should not be completely strange to you. So basically this is the implementation for that task, and what the pipeline implementation does is that it just executes all the tasks and sends in the purchase order as the subject. So again, that's the context. The Basket Pipeline is when, and the purchase order here is where and what we execute on. In this case, it's the purchase order. So set culture code task does one thing, sets the culture code of the purchase order. That's all it does, one line of code. And that's the beautiful thing here about pipelines, is that there is some logical things that happens, but instead of writing it in one huge method, which would be very cumbersome to extend because you would have to rewrite the entire thing, then each of the steps are isolated in its own little component. So it adheres to the single responsibility principle, which basically states that all types and all things should only have one responsibility. In this case, the responsibility is to set the culture code. And here we can actually see a good example where we actually facilitate the IRC container, because then we can compose the business logic in that we need, not via inheritance, but via composing the business logic in. So we inject the business logic that we need, which is in this case the business logic to find the current culture code of the website. Out of the box, UCommerce will look in the CMS for what the culture code is. But let's say that you have a special requirement that culture code is always set by query string parameters, then you could create your own implementation of this interface and inject that into the task, and then that's where the culture code would be found instead. And so it's very easy to change the business logic of the platform, because everything that happens only serves one responsibility. So you only change one thing at a time rather than a lot of different things. So that's the cool thing about these tasks here as well. So let's go back to the configuration and take a look at another example, because what the responsibility for the basket pipeline is basically to ensure that every time you modify the basket, the order total is up to date. Okay, so what it means is that when you add a product to your cart, for example, and you want to check that one out, then the series of adding a product to the cart also gives the responsibility to calculate what is the tax, to calculate is there any discounts, what is the shipping total now, what is the payment fee associated with this, and so on and so forth. And that's all the different pieces of business logic that runs that we want to compose together using the pipeline pattern here. So another great example of what's going on is you need to apply awards, which is to evaluate when I have added a product to my cart, am I now entitled to get a discount? For example, you have purchased for more than 500, now you get free shipping. Then we have to evaluate that. And then we have to calculate what is the order total now. So fairly complex stuff to evaluate all the different discount rules. But if we take a look at the implementation for this, that's also just something that are being injected in by composing the stuff together. So we inject a discount service that then has the responsibility of actually applying the awards to the orders. So something very complex is hidden away in some business logic, so it becomes very easy to read what's going on, instead of taking the implementation of this method and having it all in here. So that's a very good example of using single responsibility, where we inject the business logic, and that's what we do with dependency injection. This is basically dependency injection. I depend on this interface, so I inject it into my constructor. That means we can change which implementation that are actually being sent in case that we need that. So that's the apply awards task, and that's what's going on here. And then lastly, we have to then calculate what is the tax, and then we end up figuring out what is the order total of my cart. So we are now actually in a state where we are ready to check out. So that's the responsibility of the basket pipeline. Let's take a look at the checkout pipeline instead. So again, we have all the configuration, all the descriptions of what the checkout pipeline does. The checkout pipeline is another pipeline that runs. It implements the same interface, but the difference here is that the basket pipeline has one responsibility, whereas the checkout pipeline has another responsibility. So the same construct, but you compose it differently together with different business logic, making up the value of the actual pipeline in the pipeline via the configuration. So it's the configuration and the way that you compose it that makes all the difference. So in this case, the checkout pipeline is being run when the order is being checked out. So once the customer has entered his credit card information and we have evaluated with the payment gateway that the payment was okay, then we execute the checkout pipeline. So that's another event that's going on that you can look into. So this is at the stage where the customer actually is evaluated and are a new customer that has actually paid. So we are ready to check out the customer and convert his basket to an actual order. And that is the responsibility of the checkout pipeline. So if you take a look at the configuration for that, what we can see here is that the first step in the checkout pipeline is to validate payment made against order total. What it does is that it's sort of a safeguard for checking out the customer to prevent fraud. So imagine that the customer goes to the payment gateway and we have asked him to pay for 500. If we then open up a new browser and modify the basket to add more stuff in, he will still only have paid 500, but the value of the basket is far more. So what we can evaluate here is the order total in fact matching what the customer has paid? That's basically a safe handle to ensure that from happening in the system. So that's the first step that runs. Next step is that we assign an order number to the order. We have had some requests for customers saying that they wanted to get an order number when the basket is being created. Fine, if you want that, remove it from the pipeline here and put it into the basket pipeline instead. Fairly simple stuff where you then change the behavior of the platform only via configuration. If we should talk a little bit about that with the order numbers, order numbers will usually only be created when you are being checked out, because otherwise you will get a lot of order numbers that are still only baskets. So you will get jumping order numbers going from 1 to maybe 30 before there's a new order number that actually makes an actual order. So that's why we have it in the checkout pipeline. Next, we want to create a customer and a member for the customer, which means that first we will identify if we don't know the customer already and then create it. And then we can create a member for him in the CMS if you have configured that to be set up as well on the store. And then here we actually convert the basket to a purchase order, which means that we change order status from basket to a new order. And then later on we clear the basket information, which is basically a cookie on the user's computer. So the link is now completely gone. The user will not see his basket anymore. If you click F5, you will get a new one. That is actually the responsibility right here of the clear basket information. Then we save the purchase order, and lastly we send out a order confirmation email. So those are the different steps involved in the checkout pipeline. So to change the basket to an actual order by setting up the right order status and sending a confirmation email. So now the customer has actually successfully placed an order and can be shown the order confirmation page. All this happens, of course, internally in UCommerce, so you don't have to care about actually executing the checkout pipeline. You just have to care about what it is, what it does, and then changes it if you're not happy with it. And that's what we're going to take a look at now, how you can change pipelines in UCommerce. So we're going to do one example with the checkout pipeline, but if you want to modify other pipelines in UCommerce, this is the exact same recipe that you want to follow. You find out what pipeline do I want to modify, then I either remove or reorder it, or I add in a new pipeline task. And that is the last thing that we're going to do here. Implement the iPipeline task interface, inject a task into the checkout pipeline and see it running, so you get a sense of all the moving pieces towards pipelines in UCommerce. So we will find our Visual Studio solution and try to write some code so you can see what's actually going on. Okay, so I am back in my Visual Studio solution, and it's now time to take a look at writing an actual pipeline task for the platform. So the way that we can do this is by creating a new class. We can place that in a new project that we create if we want to. It's up to you to define your own best practices of where you want to have that placed. Typically we would have a business logic project there as well. In this case I'm just gonna create it directly under my website project, as that's the easiest way forward just for now. I will, however, group them in a logical folder that makes sense based on what I'm doing. So I will place it under pipelines, then I could have a folder per pipeline that I hook into, so it gives me very clear visibility where my stuff is located. So in this case, I want to place it under pipelines and checkout, so that indicates based on the structure that this pipeline task belongs to the actual checkout pipeline. Whatever I do inside my pipeline tasks is up to me. Typically, you would have certain responsibilities of exporting the order to a separate system. So we can try to mimic that behavior by writing to a text file some of the information that we would like to see. So that's what we will be doing in this case. So export order to EAP task. So now I just have a public class. It doesn't do anything right now, but I have to implement the interface called iPipelineTask, which sits under ucommerce.pipelines.iPipelineTask. There we go. So ucommerce.pipelines.iPipelineTask. And as I said, pipelines in uCommerce are generic, which means that I have to specify the generic parameter that my pipeline task operates on. When it's being composed together, the IC container has to compose it together in the right type, otherwise it will not work properly. And that indicates to me the interface that I'm implementing, what the type that my pipeline task works on is as well. In this case, it's ucommerce.entitiesv2.purchaseOrder. Gives me the requirement of implementing that one method called execute, which takes in the purchase order. So if I change my generic parameter here to product instead, then I have to implement that method instead, and then this method down here would be executed instead. But I cannot now hook it into the checkout pipeline because the checkout pipeline expects purchase orders. So that is not possible. So it has to be the correct interface implementation working on the correct generic parameters. In this case, it's purchase order. So we need to implement one method called execute. So execute here will be called by the pipeline implementation. It will basically just iterate over each of the pipeline tasks that has been implemented and call execute. So my code here will eventually be executed in a few minutes. So we know that that we have to implement this interface. What we also do know is that we have to adhere to the single responsibility principle. So let's create another component that we also inject into our pipeline task. EAP service. And EAP service has a single method called public void export order information, and that method is taking in a string order information like that. So we can actually see here that we can compose our stuff together as well. And let's take a look at how that actually is being done. So first I need to define my constructor, and then all the dependencies that I need needs to go in here. For this to be properly designed, it would be nice to, instead of injecting EAP service directly, have EAP service implement an interface that has the methods that I need, so I can swap out the actual implementation. Now I'm tied to an actual instance rather than an interface, but that's another architecture design session that we can have some other time. Here you just need to know that you can actually inject what you need in here into your constructor and then start using that. So what I want to do here is call subject EAP service dot export order information, and our order information in this case is just our order number, and that's it. I don't want to do anything else. Now I need to return a pipeline execution result. And the pipeline execution result is just indicating to the pipeline implementation if this task ran okay or not. If I throw an exception, then the pipeline implementation will rethrow that exception and lock the error. And it will do that if I return error as well. Then it will also execute and abort the rest of the pipeline. So that means if you have to, if it's very critical that your order has been saved before you do something like exporting it here, save the order first and then inject your pipeline task in after save, because then you ensure that at least the data in the database is correct, because the pipeline will abort if it either catches an exception or you return a execution result that is an error. So I want to return success instead. Like this. If I throw an exception or I return error, as I said, the pipeline will abort and it will actually try to reverse what it has done. So it will go through all the already executed tasks in reverse order and try to see if the task implements an interface called I on doable pipeline task. If it does that, then you actually have a chance to clean up what you've done, to sort of try to create an atomic unit of word kind of thing, where you can then redo what you've done, so that if not everything succeeds, then you can clean up again and maybe delete the exported order information or whatever you want to do. But that's an extra nice handle that you can use in case you need it. It's not something that we per se do a lot of out of the box, but you have the possibility to undo stuff that happened in case that everything or nothing has to succeed. Alright, so we return success, and that's actually it. Let's try to also write our little business logic here. In case we had an ERP system, we could export it right there. But let's try to mimic that with a file. Write all lines. This sounds about right. C:/ GMP /erp.txt, and we want to write a new array of strings with our order information. And that's it. We actually don't have to do anything else. All right. So now that we have written our code that does almost nothing, we also need to register the task into UCommerce as well. So I can build my solution, and it will actually not work right now as we haven't configured the actual pipeline task. So now we have to configure it, and we have to hook it into to the pipeline where we need it. That doesn't happen automatically because we also need to set up the context where this pipeline task is being executed. To do that, I need to find the apps folder of UCommerce. I am right here in my Umbraco masterclass, but this is, of course, goes without saying, the same thing across all CMSs. You have to find the UCommerce folder. Under the UCommerce folder, there's an apps folder where we created the masterclass index definition a while ago in one of the videos. It's out here. What I'll do is that I'll copy this configuration file and I will rename it to checkout pipeline. And now I have to register my task. And I have to do 3 things here in order to have a pipeline task injected into to a pipeline when I configure it. Just like we did with the other components, we need a component with an ID. Here we can sort of also communicate on the component where this task belongs. So checkout, we know it belongs to the checkout pipeline, and we say export order to ERP system. So that's the ID of the task. We're going to refer to that when we inject it, and here we have to specify the pipeline that we're using, or the interface we're using, which is the iPipeline task. So the component itself that we're registering is an iPipeline task. We need to say that to Carsten Winter so we can use it. The best way to find out what to write in here is to look at the documentation. So here I am on the doc side, and all the way on the bottom of the checkout pipeline, there's a code snippet that shows you how to actually create a pipeline task as well. So you can read it in the article here. If the video here is not enough, at least you have a good way of learning it in there as well. It basically does what we have here. It implements the interface, and then it registers the component. So let's try to grab the service right here. There it is. So let's write that into our service. So what we type in here is the interface that we're using. In this case, it's the iPipeline task, and then this little tick 1 parenthesis, and then the purchase order is the generic type that we're using. So that's the way that you specify generic parameters when you configure stuff in the IAC container. You define what is the interface, then you write tick, and then you have to set as many generic parameters as you have. And then inside the square braces here, you set each of the generic parameters. And that's actually it. And you have to specify the assembly as well. So a little bit of boilerplate code, not a lot, but the documentation teaches you how to do that very, very nicely. Now we have to insert also the type in our component, and the type in this case is export order to ERP task. It lives in this namespace, so I will grab that. And the type name is the class. And it lives in the simply called Umbraco master class in this case. And that's actually it. Now we have configured the component, so now when the IAC container boots, it will have this in its internal list of components that can be used. And then whenever the checkout pipeline is being initiated, then we can hook it in. But the component itself right now is not referenced or used anywhere. So in theory, this is never used until we actually initiate it and hook it into the checkout pipeline. To do that, we must use something called a partial component that helps us modify existing components in the platform. In this case, the existing component that we're modifying is the checkout pipeline. And in particular for pipelines, the partial component serves the purpose of being able to modify what's there already in a list. What we do is we do this partial component here, and then we reference the ID that we want to change. So this is sort of a way to do transform in XML. In this case, what it ends up doing is modifying the checkout pipeline and doing whatever we're doing in here. We must reference the same path what we are modifying, just like XDT, transformers, or similar. And then when we want to inject our task, we can say value insert, and then first or last, and we can also insert before or after specific components. That is if we want to insert components, but we can also remove components by saying value remove and then the ID of the component we wish to remove. And that's the way that we can change what's there out of the box as well. In this case, we're adding in functionality. I will just grab this piece here. No reason for me to type it out, but I can just steal it from the internet. Partial component. There we go. So the partial component, put that into the checkout pipeline. The checkout pipeline has a child element called parameters, tasks, and array, and that is basically the boilerplate code to configure and compose a pipeline. In this case, to configure a partial component that modifies the array element where we insert a value. And let's just insert it last. And we of course want to hook it into the component that we did. So let's change the ID here to say checkout, export order to ERP system. And let's try this out and see what happens. So I will hit F5. And the site will start up. And then let's see what's going on. I actually get an error here saying checkout.export order to ERP system is waiting for the following dependencies. Service, Umbraco, Masterclass, Pipelines, Checkout, ERP service, which was not registered. And this is where it becomes very apparent that in fact this is not really magic. There's actually something that ties everything together down there in the IAC container. What we can see is that it says checkout, which is the component that the IAC container is building. It's waiting for a dependency called checkout.export order to ERP system. That's the one that we're registering. And it says actually here it was registered, but it's also waiting for dependency. And this is the key here, but it is waiting for dependencies, which is the export order to ERP system. And that one is then lacking the ERP service. And the reason that we see this error is because we haven't registered that in the container. So now here you can actually see that it's a very apparent error that we get, and the way that we solve it is by also registering that component. So that's where we can actually see the benefit of the IAC container. We are composing our business logic together, and we can do that as long as all the components are there to be used. So in here I have to register that as well. Let's call that ERP service. And we need to give it a service, and we need to give it a type as well. Usually the service here is an interface. That's what we have up here, iPipeline task. But the service that we are registering here is actually what we are expecting in our component, right? So export order to ERP system task is our pipeline task. And it implements this interface, and then in the constructor it has a dependency for this. So the service is the actual dependency that we want to inject and use. So we're essentially what we're doing here in this pipeline task is that we are asking the IAC container for an ERP service. So when I new this up, I also want an ERP service. So what Castle Winter will do, or the IAC container that we use will do, it will find a component that has ERP service as its type, right? So typically it's an interface, because that's the best practice way of doing the design. But in this case, I just have a single class. It's also just to show that that's also possible in case we need that. So the service type that we have here is the component that we want to constructor inject. then Custom Winter will find a suited one for that. So EAP service, we need to set that here. So the service that we want to expose and be ready to use is this one, EAP service. And the type in this case, then that would then be the implementation of the interface. But in this case, it's the service and the type is the same. And that's okay. We can have that. Let's do it like this, and we don't need that. We can just auto close the element. There's no children to it. So that's what we're doing here. Now we say, okay, ISE container. When someone is asking for EAP service, give them this type here. All right, so that's the component we have here. And then, of course, if we also want that to have some dependencies, that would also work, of course. Build the solution and hit F5, and then let's see what's happening. So my site is back up and running. Let's try to do an actual checkout and see if we get some text written down into our text file. So let's find a product. Let's select the variant. Oops. Go through checkout. Download. Count. Place order. And it says, thank you for your order. Here's your order number, web 15. Let's try to explore the TMP folder. It now has ep.txt and it says web 15, and that's the code that we injected into our pipeline task right here. And that's actually it. That's how you can configure pipelines in UCommerce. I hope you learned a lot about pipelines. Otherwise, there's more information on the doc side. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video and see you in the next one.